Up next, a conversation on the future character of conflict. Please welcome retired General Joe Dunford, 19th Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Honorable Robert O. Work, 32nd Deputy Secretary of Defense, Dr. Nadia Schadlow, advisor on SCSP's Board of Advisors and former Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategy, and the Honorable Michele Flournoy, co-founder of WestExec Advisors and former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, in conversation with Gordon Lubold, national security reporter for NBC News.
Can't see a thing.
Hey everybody, welcome, or great to be here. We are here to talk about conflict, future conflict, which can be a strategy conversation, a technology conversation, wherever we kind of take it. We have four great panelists here who I think can help us lead the way. You know, I don't need to say, and I feel like it's a cliche to say we're at an inflection point, the world, the nation, but I feel like indeed we are. We're on the precipice of potentially a couple ceasefires after two long conflicts. We heard Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth recently at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore say that the U.S. and the region needs to be ready for conflict with China. I'm not quite sure if there's new intelligence or if he's just kind of sounding the alarm. We can talk about that a little bit. And then we have a number of other kind of like usual suspects of issues. At the center of it all is President Donald Trump, who has specific views, specific behaviors, one of which is unpredictability. I'd love to kind of talk about that. Although this is not a political conversation, I think the president here is the subtext for a lot of what we were here to talk about over the next hour. And so if you know me, like I like to jump around a little bit, but so my panelists will keep me honest and help rein me in if we kind of get too far afield. But what I was hoping to do was just briefly go down the line, Michele, Nadia, Bob, and then General Dunford, kind of give a quick 2 or 3 minute view of how they see the world in the context that what I've just kind of like laid out. And then we'll just jump into questions, if that's okay. Michele, please.
Sure. Well, great to see everybody here this morning. You know, I do think, when I think about it in my lifetime, I don't think I've ever experienced a period of such uncertainty and volatility and fundamental shifts and change in the international system. I think we are moving from the sort of rules-based order that's defined the last 8 decades of our experience into a much more volatile, multipolar, competitive world, where we're going to face the primary challenge of a multi-dimensional strategic competition with China that has military, technological, economic, ideological components, but also a potential resurgence of competition with a power like Russia, particularly if Russia emerges from the Ukraine war if Putin emerges with any sense of a win. I think we will be in for a very dark period in terms of European security and so forth. I also, at the same time, the topic of this panel, we're seeing a fundamental changes in the way wars are being fought, most specifically in Ukraine. And so I think, as we look to the future, we're going to need much faster decision-making, enabled by AI, more resilient C4ISR, so that we can get inside the OODA loop of our adversaries and beat them in terms of the quality and speed of our decision-making. We're going to need to be able to mass precision fires from great distances, whether that's long-range precision fire or massing drones. That's a great way to buy back mass. Human machining with drones under the sea, on the sea, and in the air. Very appropriate that we're hearing the drone races noise next to us here. And then much greater dispersal of forces, lower signatures, as we've seen just in the last 2 days, more concealment, deception, sabotage, that kind of thing. And just, again, agility, agility, agility. I mean, that is the name of the game. And that's going to require us to do some different things as an armed forces going into the future to be ready for that, and to really underscore the name of the game, which is deterrence. But I'll stop there.
Sounds great, Michele, thanks. So, Nadia, please.
Thanks, Gordon. So in terms of the broader picture of where the world is, I mean, I think fundamentally I'm looking at it now as there are countries that are seeking to shape a reordering, new architectures, and are determined to drive that and feel that it's necessary. I think there are countries that are more resistant to that, and I think we're seeing sort of some of the tensions play into that, and I think obviously President Trump is on the determination to get to new architectures, and I think there are a smaller number of countries, the countries are sort of in the middle, some saying, no, we need to sort of preserve what we've had in the past, and I think we're seeing all of that play out. I think it will continue to play out, but I do think there are opportunities there to look at what we can work on together, roll up our sleeves together, sit down and think about how we want to shape that reordering that I think is coming. I think fundamentally in some ways it's about less centralization, more nationalism, less centralization, and I think that's how it's playing out on the broad level. In terms of the subject of the panel on future war, I actually see, or what I would like to think about, and what I think everyone in the room should think about, is how technologies are actually impacting what I see as some continuing fundamentals in this space. And I don't think we talk about that enough. Control of territory, and for how long? Control of populations, and for how long? And political outcomes. And how do we match the technologies that we're all speaking about at this event, AI, drones, precision-guided munitions, to those three elements that I think are still fundamental to war. The wars that we're seeing now are being played out over, they're profoundly political, historical conflicts. And how, it's actually, I don't know the answer, but how do the technologies that we're discussing today impact those three elements of war that I see as enduring? And I think we need to discuss that more, develop the operational concepts to connect some of the technologies to those three elements, if you think they're still relevant, and I do. Thank you.
Terrific. Bob, please.
Thanks, Gordon. I'd say that's nice to see you, but honestly, I can't see any of it with the lights in our eyes.
It's true.
But this is about the changing character of war, and I think there's absolutely no debate on whether that is occurring or not. And it's coming as a junction of three broad changes. One is the change in the strategic competition that the U.S. is now faced with. One is with the rapidly advancing, emerging tech that we see all around us. And the third thing is the emergence of new operating domains. And it's the combination of those three things that are changing the character of war. On the strategic competition side, I generally try to look, as a former deputy secretary, I try to look at the strategic competition through the lens of what the department calls the force planning construct, which is the construct which tells the joint force, these are the fights you have to be ready for, and here is the capacity that you need to have to do it. For 20 years after Operation Desert Storm, through a series of defense reviews, the focus was on regional adversaries and generally swift outcomes. That started to fray in the 2014 QDR when we said, okay, Joint Force, you're going to have to defeat one regional adversary in a large-scale campaign. That was code word for China. And then you deny the objectives or impose unreasonable costs, unacceptable costs on a second aggressor in a different theater. And that was the first time that the department was signaling, look, we're not sure that the regional adversary thing works anymore, because a rising China and a resurgent Russia, which were put in the regional adversary category up through 2014, just didn't work anymore. So in 2018, this was a big change. We had to deter in 3 regions. we had to win one great power war. First time in our force planning construct, which we told the joint force, you have to be able to defeat a great power, either China or Russia. And then you had to deter the other or another adversary in a second theater. That in and of itself would have sparked a change to the character of war, at least for the joint force, because we would not be able to fight competitors like China and Russia like we had fought regional adversaries like Iraq. And the Great Power War, it tells you a lot about how things are changing. First, homeland defense is much more important, especially on the cyber defense side. Both Russia and China are deep inside of our networks, and a lot of different experts have said this is just intelligence preparation of the battlefield. They are preparing for conflict. And of course, it calls for missile defense. War in space. Both Russia and China have developed an enormous capability to go after our capabilities in space, and the US Joint Force cannot win a great power war without space superiority, period. End of paragraph. We rely on space capabilities so that we can put our battle networks together, because of course we have to go across oceans to fight our fights. And then in terms of the new operating domains, you heard this morning in the first panel talking about seabed to low Earth orbit. Seabed warfare is now a big thing. Both of our great power adversaries will go after seabed infrastructure, underwater cables, underwater energy producing capabilities. And the other thing, I'm talking too long, I'm sorry, Gordon.
No, you're good, you're good.
The other thing is Russia talks a lot about the initial period of war. A lot of their doctrine is now shifting focus to that part, and they're trying to gain an advantage before the war goes kinetic. So that might be things like major cyber attacks on the United States, might be sabotage of our ports and our railroads. And meanwhile, on the China side, they're shifting all their attention to protracted warfare, which we have never considered really as a Department of Defense, at least not in a coherent way, in my view. Joe may disagree. So, without question, our adversaries are forcing a change in the character of warfare, and then emerging tech is just accelerating that trend. Thanks, Gordon.
Gordon, everyone has spoken about change, and as I was sitting here, I think maybe what I'll do is just talk about what I think are the most significant changes since when Secretary Work and Secretary Carter were in the Department of Defense, and I took off the uniform in 2019. It's been alluded to, but obviously alignment of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea is significant. And in the National Defense Strategy that was really crafted in 2016 and then produced another one in 2018, we talked about the most important strategic imperative was not allowing an alignment between China and Russia. So that now is obviously an important part of the current security environment. The relevance of nuclear weapons compared to 4 or 5 years ago. One, I don't think we can take strategic stability for granted. We have now a growing three-body problem with China, Russia, and the United States. There's no arms control to speak of that's in place right now, and there's not a non-proliferation regime in place, and we're now dealing with Iran and North Korea, so that'd be kind of the second challenge. One challenge that certainly existed during that time, but has been exacerbated is, the U.S. ability to project power where it needed to anywhere in the world and then to operate freely across any domain. Secretary Work talked about space, but it's obviously sea, air, land space, and cyberspace. And our competitive advantage, and frankly the foundation of conventional deterrence, for years was our ability to project power and then operate freely when we got there to advance a campaign. And I think we all understand, we've been talking about anti-access area denial for a decade or more, but I think we all understand the challenge now the United States has projecting power. And I don't mean just in a traditional sense of sending forces to another region around the world, but we're obviously talking about space and cyberspace as well. That's contested. I think we've seen now that we can't assume that conflicts will be quick and short. And so we've seen a defense industrial base that's challenged to keep up with supporting the United States, supporting our allies and partners, and supporting ongoing conflicts simultaneously. So all those things are happening, and what needs to happen? What problem are we trying to solve, if you will? One, I think we need to think about nuclear deterrence, not take that for granted, and we can't take strategic stability for granted. Number two, we need to restore conventional deterrence. Again, I would define it as our ability to project power and operate freely when we get there, achieve superiority. That's the calculus, I think, that has kept our adversaries from initiating conventional war. We obviously need to deal with conflicts that are kind of below that conventional level. We see that, and we have seen that now for a decade. We need to think about the as-is and to-be defense industrial base. And although the whole topic of the couple of days here in the convention center is about technology, that is a piece of it, is mastering, accelerating technology. But the important piece is to stay focused on what is it we need to be able to do in the context of emerging technology. And that's where I would focus on deterrence, being able to respond if deterrence fails. And again, something we probably wouldn't have talked about much in 2015, 16, or 17 was nuclear deterrence, strategic stability, arms control, nuclear proliferation, and all of those are factors right now. So Michele opened it up by talking about how complex and volatile the security environment is. I think all of our conversations about how to leverage technology and what the joint force ought to be able to do, we just need to stay focused on to do what, and that'd be my opening.
Right. It reminds me of, I'll bastardize the remarks that Bob Gates made, whatever, being so bad at predicting the next conflict or whatever. So I already bastardized it there, but I think you get the idea. Just because it's top of mind for me, so great openers, a lot there. Like I said, we'll probably bounce around a little bit, but it's top of mind for me. This Ukrainian attack on the fighters, surprise, a reminder that Kyiv's still got game, of course. But to bring it home, a friend of mine reminded me of kind of the connection here. We had this very strange series of drones that were swarming Langley Air Force Base in December of 23. It was kind of strange. At the time, I worked for the Wall Street Journal. We really delved into it a lot. What is the danger the U.S. confronts with cheap unmanned drones, which is kind of a regular question, but a good one still, but here on the homeland, and then we may segue into Golden Dome stuff in a minute. But how do you, and not everybody has to answer each question, but jump in if you at will, but how do you guys view the threat in the U.S. from these kinds of drones, wherever they're from? We still don't know in December where they came from.
Yeah. I think when you think about China and their doctrine, we know that their objective, should we have a crisis and a potential breakdown of deterrence, is to use operations in space, in cyberspace, to create enough havoc and panic and chaos inside the United States that it saps our political will to actually project power and defend Taiwan or whatever the objective is. I think what we saw with Ukraine just now has reminded us there are other tactics for doing that too. And you could imagine somebody smuggling in, or not even smuggling in, but just acquiring and using drone swarms inside the United States against key military targets, alongside cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, alongside efforts to limit our capabilities in space. And it could have a very profound effect. I think it's one of the reasons why the department went forward with this Replicator 2 initiative in the last administration, which I sincerely hope will be survive and scaled in this administration, which is really focused on counter-UAS, not only for protecting our forces and assets and operations overseas, but also here at home. And it is a reminder that one of the other changing factors of warfare in the future is it will almost certainly include the homeland as an area of operations, not just from air and missile threats, but from sabotage to cyber to potential drone use as well.
Yeah, good. Nadia.
I'll just add quickly, I think the attack shows us that Russia's traditional reliance or a comfort with strategic depth that it's always had is it's not the same anymore, right? It's quite vulnerable, but by the same token, it's the same problem with us, that we've traditionally had a reliance on strategic depth, in our case, the oceans, and Russia and China land. We need to rethink that concept, and I think the drone attack really shows that. It's more than geography is not going to protect you.
Hey, Gordon, just a quick comment. A lot of times we talk about the character war and how it's changed. We do focus on technology, and that is certainly an important aspect of how it's changed. But something Michele said, I think, deserves a foot stomp. I mean, one of the more profound ways that conflict has changed is, number one, it's going to be global in nature. There are global implications. We talked earlier about the alignment of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and we just emphasized that the homeland is going to be involved. And then it's going to involve all domains. I mean, if you just think about the 1990s, we assumed that conflict would be someplace else in the world, isolated to a specific region, and we developed a joint force that was capable of dealing with that type of conflict. And what really, beyond highlighting the potential of unmanned systems and the implications of artificial intelligence and the specifics of the attack in Russia, what it reminds us of is the vulnerability we have here at home to asymmetric attacks.
Right.
As long ago as the 1990s, we spoke about cyber vulnerabilities as they affected the joint force being able to deploy from the United States, sustain itself from the United States and fight. And I think what we now have seen, whether it's latent Chinese activity in our infrastructure, or we see the potential of drones, and you spoke about some unexplained activity around some of our facilities, we need to start looking at ourselves through the lens of an adversary that for 20 years has studied us, identified what they perceive to be our vulnerabilities, and developed capabilities specific to that. And what the Ukrainians have done just is accelerate the cycle of taking a look at the Russians, exploiting vulnerabilities, and deciding in an asymmetric way to go after what the Russians hold dear and to help themselves at the table when it comes to diplomacy. But it's an asymmetric attack, and I think the broader lesson from this is less about the specifics of the attack and more about the expectation that we will face asymmetric attacks from our adversaries against our space capabilities, against our cyber capabilities, and against our physical infrastructure.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's the asymmetrical aspects of this is critical because both China and Russia would want to knock us off our game if it ever got close to a kinetic fight. Homeland defense, generally, I think most people have thought about that as far as protecting the homeland against ballistic and hypersonic missile attack. But as Ukraine has showed us, these asymmetric attacks using very cheap uncrewed systems or drones brings the whole kinetic aspect of homeland defense really that much closer. I'd also say that warfare at the operational level of war is now dominated by guided munitions warfare. And guided munitions generally hit the targets that you fire at. When you were using unguided bombs, you would have to just put a big bomb pile on a place or fire big salvos of missiles just to get the statistical probability of a target hit. With guided munitions, you only have to shoot enough munitions to saturate the defense, because any leaker is probably going to hit the target and achieve effects. And The Russians, when they think about this, they have said this is a revolution in war because using guided munitions backed by what they call reconnaissance strike complexes achieve the effects of tactical nuclear weapons. And I wanted to go back to what Joe was saying about nuclear weapons and how important they are. The step between large-scale guided munitions bombardment and introducing tactical nuclear weapons is turning into a very small step. So the chances of us seeing atomic weapons on the battlefield is going up. I think, deciding to throw nuclear or long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles at the United States because of the strategic stability aspects, that's a pretty risky operation, or risky decision. But on the battlefield, especially Russia, which really thinks nuclear weapons are an important part of their operational concepts, is just another indication of how things are changing and how difficult and dangerous it's going to be.
What can the U.S. take from Ukraine's ability to quickly, and Michele, you mentioned just kind of decision-making, shortening decision-making, but probably in a slightly different context, but just in terms of procurement and in terms of like getting new adaptive technology on the battlefield quickly, what can the U.S. kind of in a nutshell take from that aspect of Ukraine's ability to respond so quickly?
Gordon, I'll start with one point, is a sense of urgency, and this is not, what Ukraine is doing is not new. They're adapting at the speed of relevance in a war. I'll just go back to our experience. I remember in the 1990s, there was a young Marine captain writing articles all the time about South African V-shaped hulls and the challenges that improvised explosive devices would present to us were we to go to war. And we kind of knew that, and we admired the problem, and then there was nothing that we couldn't throw against the problem in 2003, 4, and 5. And I think at the end of the day, what Ukraine has demonstrated to us is, what a sense of urgency in incentivizing kind of a decentralized approach to innovation can deliver. And we should, I think, from this lesson, consider ourselves at war from the perspective of adapting right now, given the security environment everyone here, and I'm sure over the course of the 3 days has described, it'd be hard for me to say that we are not currently at war in the form that we've described. And I think the biggest thing that Ukraine has shown us is, hey, if you have a sense of urgency and you have a very specific focus on a very specific problem and you unleash the best and brightest against that problem, you can do something to solve that problem.
Right.
And we have that capacity within the Department of Defense. I'm confident of it from having observed that over many years, and we have that capacity in the private sector. I'm not sure that we have the same sense of urgency. A better way to say it is we don't have the same sense of urgency as Ukraine does right now, and I think that probably to me is one of the big themes that we ought to have, even with regard to budgetary processes and acquisition and all those kinds of things. Everybody's plodding along, and we're identifying a problem, we're grinding away and trying to solve them, but we're clearly not evolving fast enough in the context of the challenges that we've just spoken about.
As a journalist, there's nothing like the clarity of deadline, as my editors will tell you. But like we don't have, the U.S., although it is at war in some way, it doesn't have the deadline, doesn't have the urgency to deal with it. Nadia, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think, three words that need to be a part of the department as much as offense, defense. Adaptation, agility, to Michele's point, and producibility or scalability. And we need to actually hold the department and parts of it, the relevant parts of it, accountable to those three elements. I think Ukraine has really shown us that, and adaptability has been especially important as the Russians have developed countermeasures, and they've been able to develop, counters to those countermeasures. But also, I think it has shown us a bit how we need to rethink stockpiling as well. It's more about, stockpiling can also be another term for obsolescence, right? So it goes back to, Maybe it's less stockpiling and more on the producibility, adaptability, agility. We can use the commercial sector to do that much more effectively. There are lots of companies here represented who are doing advanced manufacturing, producing commercial products that they can also produce products relevant to the department with slight changes, obviously, at the tail end of the cycle.
Funny, because Ukraine has burned up all these stockpiles, U.S. stockpiles. It's not clear that the U.S. has adapted, and it's taking advantage of the fact that they've used some of this other stuff to adapt the new stuff.
Right.
So.
I would say, to General Dunford's point, a true sense of urgency at the leadership level is absolutely imperative. And I actually hear most DoD leaders expressing that urgency, but the system itself is not acting with urgency, because we have an acquisition and contracting system that has been designed to procure very exquisite, complicated systems over decades. Principal emphasis on keeping things on schedule, on budget, very, very risk averse. And no one gets rewarded for taking risk, moving faster if it increases the risk of failure, et cetera. So rather than boil the ocean of the acquisition system, I actually think we need to build a new subsystem, if you will, or a new cadre of people who have the technological literacy to understand commercial and dual-use technologies and how venture-backed and private equity-backed companies work, and from a business case and what they need to survive and be able to provide the department with capabilities with speed and scale. We need to incentivize and reward those people differently, so that the way you get promoted is to lean in, take risk, fail fast, learn, try again, and succeed, and to have that be different training, different incentives, different rewards, different promotions. My biggest lesson in the Pentagon, one of them, was you can try to give strategic guidance all you want, but you're not going to get a change of behavior unless you realign all the incentives to that set of objectives. And so I think that we haven't done that yet. That's a missing piece of the puzzle. And then I think you need to have needs to be a much shorter chain that actually involves the warfighter from the beginning of choosing. They're the ones with intimacy about the problems, the gaps, the operational issues we're trying to solve. Give them a seat at the table in deciding what technology they're interested in, playing around with it, experimenting it, rapidly developing new operational concepts, competing those concepts in training and experimentation, and then being alongside the acquisition and contracting people as they procure the system. Because any commercial system, there's going to be that last mile of non-recurring engineering to really adapt it to the military's needs. And you got to have the warfighter voice strongly at the table as part of that process. That is a chain that we have not built yet, and we have not incentivized, and I don't think we're going to get to the speed and scale we need to actually manifest that urgency into real, change in what we're providing to the warfighters in the field.
Hey, Gordon, just one quick comment, because I think there is, as I look at the department from the outside, there is one very positive dynamic that I see, and that is the increased experimentation that's going on within the services, at the combatant commands. I'm sure that we've had a number of speakers here over the last couple of days. I haven't seen them all, but I'm sure people like General Donovan and the vice chiefs and the chiefs that have spoken about that. But I think it's very real and it's ongoing. In the collaboration with industry at that experimentation level, I think is much improved, even in the few years since I was in the department. I think the big bridge that has yet to be, we haven't figured it out, is the scaling of this and transitioning to a program of record. There is a tremendous amount of activity that started with Defense Innovation Unit back in Secretary Carter's day. Tremendous amount of innovation, experimentation going on that's funded by the department, it's funded by organizations inside the defense industrial base. But as I see it from the outside, it's really hard to take that experimentation and that innovation really is legitimate in many cases, and then translate it into a program of record and scale it. And that's the piece that I think we need to focus on. So I only wanted to highlight that I think we have improved on the early end, significantly improved. Really going back as far as 2016, significantly improved, you know, the activity to identify emerging technology and the potential of emerging technology and so forth. Where I think we haven't improved then is taking that next step and crossing the bridge. And I think it's important to give credit where credit is due, because it's true.
Yeah, because I think with a nod to Secretary Carter, his DIU X, I liked it when the X was still part of it. But DIU now is doing a lot of good things, but like has not reached kind of critical mass inside as a kind of a cultural change inside the building. I think some people would say you got to blow up the requirements kind of sector of the bureaucracy. But anyway,
Gordon, I'd just like
yeah,
to
Bob.
say, I think it's very unfair to compare, even though we may be in an initial period of war, we have peacetime processes in the Department of Defense. And to compare that against Ukraine, which is in the middle of an existential fight for their existence, I don't think is fair. Because you can take a look, there are very few military organizations that are more innovative in a war than the United States Joint Force. I'll just give you one simple example. In Operation Iraqi Freedom, we were surprised, or our intel just wasn't good enough. Saddam Hussein pushed a lot of his command and control bunkers really deep underground. And none of the weapons that we had could reach them. So I don't know whether it originated in the Air Force Research Lab or if it was just an aviator. They said, hey, don't we have a lot of excess cannon barrels? Yeah, we do. These things are really strong. So let's fill the cannon barrels with TNT, or whatever it is, and turn it into a bomb. And in 28 days, from the time somebody said, I've got an idea, to that bomb burrowing through the earth and blasting the crap out of a command and control, 28 days, that's how long it took. So I would compare the Joint Forces' wartime innovation to Ukraine anytime.
I don't disagree with that. I think what we really need, though, to focus on now is what does the joint force need to look like on day one? So, you know, Colin Powell used to say, how good do we have to be? We have to be good enough, right? So we've got to be good enough on day one, benchmarked against those challenges we just spoke about. And we need to be postured to act with the speed of relevance in the fight. And this is where I feel like we're probably in a position where we couldn't overcome it if we had to. If you assume, like I do, that conflict will be protracted, I think that's something we should consider. I'm not sure we can do what we did in World War II to accelerate the path of capability development and production. And so I think we need to think about, I don't disagree at all with what Secretary Work said, but I do think that we need to think about how quickly we can react once war starts, and then also what does mobilization look like in the 21st century, and from the foundational perspective, have we set the conditions to be able to mobilize in a 21st century context? And that latter piece is a physics problem. We won't be able to cheat time when the time comes, and if we haven't established a latent ability to be able to scale, it's very unlikely we'll be able to do that fast enough to overcome the challenges we're likely to face in the opening days of war.
But I think part of mobilization in the 21st century has to involve the commercial sector in the way that it did during World War II, but there's still differences. We cannot mobilize at scale without elements of the commercial sector. So, and there are models and operational models and approaches to doing that, and I think there are people thinking about how to do that.
I want to come back to that, but Michele.
No, I just wanted to add, I hope that some of the additional money that the Department of Defense looks like it will be receiving will go to sort of really scaling the effort to restock our munitions, especially precision munitions. We've done the right thing and provided a lot of those to Ukraine with Presidential Drawdown Authority. We've done a lot, providing to Taiwan and others, very important, but we need to rebuild and modernize our own stocks and have those ready on day one. I also think we need to really look closely at adversary content in our weapon systems. This is a challenge we have not taken seriously. There are companies out there in the hall.
What are you talking about? I think I know what you're talking about.
So,
but
Chinese components
Yeah.
that are in our fighter jets, that are in our missiles, that are in our, whatevers. For the longest time, we felt like we didn't have the technology and the transparency to really know where those supply chains were beyond level 4 or 5. I think there are some companies in the hallway here who are specializing in doing that using AI. So we need to get much more serious about finding alternative suppliers or developing alternative suppliers and reducing that dependency where we find it, because that is, along with critical minerals, rare earths, is a real potential chokehold that China has for us in any kind of conflict scenario.
And this gets to onshoring and friendshoring. But I just wanted to go back. The fight in the Red Sea, which we saw under the Biden administration and then was essentially re-upped under President Trump and then abruptly kind of ended, at least for the US, it seems. But what, in this context of readiness and stockpiles, what do you individuals see as the takeaway from the fight against the Houthis? To me, the policy decisions aside, which we can't totally ignore, but we'll just put, the expenditures of munitions in the Red Sea is tremendous. I think a lot of it's very classified, but I think we have a general sense that the U.S. has used a lot against essentially an asymmetric adversary in the Houthis. What's the lesson learned from doing this, and is the U.S. prepared to resupply the way it needs to from the private sector and onward? Anybody?
I would just building on the last comment, it's not just restocking the exquisite systems that we always had, but I think the lesson learned from that is, we were stuck using exquisite systems against a very a real but inexpensive sort of threat, and we need to change that cost equation so that we have much less expensive options for destroying or dealing with that kind of threat in the future. So it's not just restocking what we've, the high-end sophisticated systems, but creating more options that give us an advantage, a cost advantage as well, going forward.
One quick two-finger on that. General Kurilla recently in testimony said the only way to defeat a ballistic missile from a maritime platform is an SM-6 missile.
Right.
We don't want to be shooting SM-6 missiles at a Houthi threat.
So expensive.
Right.
We won't be firing very long before we go broke. So we need alternative ways of dealing with those low-end threats that address this cost curve issue.
Yeah.
I think historians will look back on that example and say this was the period at which the United States did not actually develop that cheap scalability, because we might have used it with undersea autonomy.
Yeah.
All of that, it's not there at scale. But I think the Houthi example is also one of political will, right? It went on for a long, long time, so it was a good combination. It's more than just about munitions and the some of these mobilization issues. It's also about political will to have maybe cut that off sooner.
Right. I think of the big U.S. Navy ships that were in the Red Sea that were vulnerable to attack. Obviously, a lot of shipping. Move to Asia. I'm just curious what everybody thinks about what deterrence looks like in Asia. As I said at the top, Secretary Hegseth kind of sounding the alarm in the region recently for a potential conflict there. Even setting that aside, peace through strength or whatever. What does peace through strength look like in the region to all of you? Do we need to be devoting more resources, or is there a military footprint, or is there a danger of thinking about the last conflict for a future conflict? There, anybody?
Well, we definitely don't want to overlearn the lessons of the Red Sea. U.S. Navy ships there are generally radiating 24/7. All their radars are up, all their ESN systems are operating, and if you do that in the Western Pacific, you're toast.
Right.
The Chinese will quickly target you and fire as many missiles at you as they can possibly do so. The key thing is what everybody's already talked about. How do you go after the low and slow stuff in a cost-effective way? And it so happens that we are seeing how to do that. The Air Force took, I can't remember the name of the missile. It's a air-to-ground rocket that generally was developed for our attack helicopters. And you put a semi-actor laser guidance system on the front end, and it becomes a guided weapon. And so what the Air Force just did is they are now putting those onto F-15s, and each of the launchers carries 7 of these rockets. They're very cheap. If you fire an AMRAAM, that's $1 million round. If you fire a AIM-9, which is the infrared-guided air-to-air missile, I think that's like 300 or 400,000. But these rockets, air-to-air rockets, are relatively dirt cheap. And so they put 3 or 4 of these launchers on an F-15, and they take off, and they have over 40 engagement opportunities against smaller UASs. And you start to change the cost curve in our favor. So you're already seeing that. Again, goes to my point that when people are firing at you, there's a lot of innovation going on, because people are saying, hey, I don't want to get hit.
Yeah.
So to your question in Western Pacific, our force planning construct and our national defense strategy says the number one thing we want to do is to be able to prevent a fait accompli attack on Taiwan, which means they do it so quickly, it's over, and we really have no recourse other than to accept the outcome. So establishing deterrence in the Western Pacific, one thing you have to do is convince the Chinese that you can stop a fait accompli attack. And that goes to Joe's point on force posture. How many forces are forward? Are they protected? What type of weapons do you have immediately available for the salvo battle? How can you keep those missiles getting into the fight so that you can continue to fight? So you have to put in the minds of the Chinese war planners, they know they're going to be able to do it. Admiral Paparo, the commander of Indo-PACOM, has a new operational concept that he refers to as hellscape, which is really relying on uncrewed systems in innovative ways with advanced munitions, et cetera, to be able to do this. Now, just solving the fait accompli attack isn't good enough. We also have to worry about a blockade. How would we go about that? You'd need a lot more Navy ships to do that. So, and also our allies in the region are absolutely critical. And I think you see the Quad, India, Japan, Australia, the United States. You see new innovations between the US and the Philippines on being able to put long-range missile units into their landmass. Japan. Our allies are absolutely critical to convincing the Chinese you're not going to be able to win this fight.
Yeah.
So
I have an allies question in a second. Anybody else want to just jump in on deterrence in the region quick first? Anybody else?
I think, there's, every day you want President Xi to wake up and think, not today, it's
Right.
too risky, right? And part of that is capability, as Bob described. I think that, if we're successful in realizing the sort of hellscape concept, which basically says anything trying to project power from China to Taiwan is going to be a target and can be hit or destroyed. I think the more worrisome, the more difficult scenario for us is actually a blockade or quarantine. We have just seen, I think it was something like 90 ships in an exercise around Taiwan. I was in Taiwan just after that, and they were very disturbed about what they'd experienced. My worry is that you could have a Chinese exercise that suddenly becomes an actual operation. So I'm hoping that we're doing a lot of thinking and planning about how would you counter a blockade, how would you force the Chinese to really test their resolve in that, and how would we try to break that blockade. Totally agree with the allies question. I think politically, if Xi believes that Japan, Australia, Philippines, and others will be in there with us on day one, that really elevates the risk for him. But the last piece that we haven't talked about is resolve. He has to believe that the US president would actually be willing to defend Taiwan or whatever, Philippines, whoever, against unprovoked Chinese aggression. And, President Biden was asked 4 times, would you defend Taiwan in that instance? And he said one-word answer, yes. And 4 times his staff ran out and tried to say, well, no policy change here. But he was speaking, he was trying to communicate with Xi,
right.
Like, I am committed. The honest answer is we don't know what President Trump really believes on Taiwan and whether that resolve is really there. So I think that will, over the next coming years, will be an important part of the equation, is how does this administration choose to express resolve beyond force posture and capability development.
Hey, Gordon,
Nadia.
just a quick comment.
And I'm going to come to Nadia because
on the
unique insights here.
For the Xi not today and really to provide the foundation of political resolve. In my view, if she looks out and sees that we have resilient space capabilities, resilient cyber capabilities, resilient physical infrastructure in the Pacific, the ability to integrate and develop solutions across all domains, and Taiwan as a country is hardened and able to present a hard target in the early days of a war, that's an important part of the equation. And then we can project power to reinforce those forces that are forward deployed in the Pacific. All of those are things that if you had Admiral Paparo here today, he'd be talking about that. But back to this question about how fast are we going, if she would look at us today, he might say, well, there are some vulnerabilities that they have in space, and I can probably go after their command and control capabilities. Some of their physical infrastructure is at risk, and I can do something like what Ukraine did to Russia. And frankly, given the ability of us to put these anti-access area denial strategies in place that we've been looking at for the last 20 years, I can probably keep these guys from closing the force in a relevant period of time to reinforce Taiwan. So those are the things that we ought to be focused on when we think about Xi's calculus in addition to the political resolve piece.
Nadia, I want to put you on the spot because you worked for Trump 1.0. You would have unique insights into his thinking, at least at that time.
No one has unique insights.
Do you think the president has resolve when it comes to the region?
I do. I think he is continuing a policy of strategic ambiguity, which has been effectively U.S.
very
policy.
ambiguous right now.
It has strategic ambiguity combined with the pre-positioning and the military measures that General Dunford, Michele, and Secretary Work have talked about is a foundation for deterrence. You don't know exactly what we're going to do. You create difficult calculations for Xi. And I think, with due respect to President Biden, the yes and the no creates also strategic ambiguity,
right.
To Michelle's point. It was really no different. There was ambiguity there as well because of the need to correct. So I think it's a continuation of that policy.
Real quick, Eli Ratner, who was in the Pentagon for Asia policy, put out a thing recently arguing for a defense pact in the region, a NATO for Asia. Just real quick, I'm curious because I have another question before we get the clock gives us the hook. Do you think that's a good idea? I mean, the broader question is, how does this administration foster and nurture allies in the region, which I think most of you all agree it needs? But the kind of mixed messages sometimes for different reasons, economically and politically and otherwise, may make it harder to kind of galvanize those allies.
Yeah, I'm a huge Eli fan. We worked together for many years at CNAS, but I have to disagree on a formal pact, because I think for most of our partners and allies, their primary trading partner remains China, and their preferred security partner remains the United States. If we put them in a position of having to choose, I think, first of all, it puts them in a very awkward position. Second of all, it's going to be a very small grouping that, frankly, we're already doing very deep work with on a bilateral basis, on a multilateral basis. And if you do an official pact, now you force China to respond to that in all kinds of political and economic ways and put pressure on our partners that may actually ultimately be to our detriment. So I'm not convinced that the region is ready for this.
Good.
And just I agree with Michele, and a pact without the capabilities just creates a hollow alliance.
Yep.
So I would focus on establishing those capabilities, getting up to where they need to be.
So a pact without calling it a pact.
All right, here we go. We got 1 minute 36 seconds. I hate to say what keeps you up at night, but you've all touched on a bunch of issues. It's been a great conversation as far as I'm concerned. But what are you most scared of for the next 4, 5, 10 years or whatever it is in terms of conflict, in terms of whether it be space, whether it be whatever, whether it be, I won't take the time to explain. Anyway, what do you guys?
I think deterrence is going to be tested, and my fear is that we are not moving fast enough. We haven't talked much on AI. I know we're running out of time.
No, right, sorry.
But accelerating and scaling AI adoption from the back office all the way to the warfighter, we have got to get that done. And I do think that this administration will continue what began prior in trying to lean forward, break down the barriers to that, put all the fundamentals in place so that we can actually get there. But we are not where we need to be.
Not where you need to be.
For responsible AI.
I want everybody to answer this question if I could in the remaining few minutes.
Just that we won't be able to reduce the problems that we make for ourselves, and we all know what they are, so that we can actually focus on the external problems that we really have. So we just are stuck in this cycle of repetition, and we need to move beyond it. We know the problems we have to solve and can solve for ourselves.
Okay. Oh.
Thing that keeps me up at night is that we enter into an armed conflict with the People's Republic of China through, a mistake or miscalculation. That type of war would be disastrous for us, would be disastrous for China, be disastrous for the global system. And there's a lot of talk now, she's ready to go. I mean, within 2 years, we're going to drop gloves and start to fight. And we're getting to a place where it makes me uncomfortable, where we would read something incorrectly and say, okay, they're getting ready to go. Because in all our war games, the first mover in the Western Pacific has the advantage, a big advantage, especially if they move first in space. So do you get to a point where you convince yourself, I've got to move or I will lose? And so the likelihood of a war is going up. It's not inevitable. But we are getting into, I think Michele said, a very fraught international environment.
Good. Turn it on for the last word. What keeps you?
Yeah, so I'll just be a little more near term, and I would just say the highest probability of conflict in the near term has to be Iran, and that's a problem that has to be solved with a sense of urgency. We are at the point right now, recent inspections highlighted it once again, where Iran is with regard to uranium enrichment. We know where the Israelis are with regard to Iran, and we are watching the diplomatic track unfold, and it's hard to tell from the outside, but it doesn't look particularly promising. That problem is probably a 30, 60, 90-day problem as opposed to a 2-year problem.
Yeah, fair point. Folks, thanks so much. If you could join me and thank our panel. Really appreciate everybody's time. Thanks for the thoughtful answers.